Hi, I'm David Alzamendi, independent data architect and consultant, and today we're going to be looking at how to monitor the fabric capacity and the performance, as well as how to apply some of the optimization techniques on how to reduce costs or a few hints and tips that might save you time and money as well. All right, let's get started. When we think of fabric capacity, so first we have to introduce a few concepts. And the first one, of course, is the one of the architecture. So remember, within Microsoft Fabric, you have essentially the tenant, and the tenant represents your organization. So this is the Microsoft intra-tenant. You usually only have one in your organization, but some organizations, because they provide services to multiple providers, so they might have multiple tenants. But in a nutshell, ideally, it's likely that you only have one tenant, the Microsoft intra-tenant. And then within that tenant, remember, from the old days in Power BI, so you have different workspaces. So what happens is that you can assign different Microsoft Fabric capacities to those workspaces. That means that the relationship between the number of workspaces and number of capacities is one workspace can belong to one Microsoft Fabric capacity, but you could have multiple Microsoft Fabric capacities. And why is that? Why would you have multiple Microsoft Fabric capacities? So there are many reasons for that. First one is workload isolation. Remember, when you get a Microsoft Fabric capacity in Azure, that means that you're allocated a specific number of resources, compute power. So you might want to isolate different workloads. You might want to have a Microsoft Fabric capacity to run all your data movements and transformations, and you might want to have a different Microsoft Fabric capacity for all the reporting and front-facing apps. But on top of that, as you can see in this example, you could have different Microsoft Fabric capacities for different departments. So that way, you can also have a pricing model where you pass the cost to some of those departments, if that's the model that you're following. And within those Microsoft Fabric capacities, of course, you have to learn how to monitor and optimize the resources. When you get the Microsoft Fabric capacity, and remember, we have a lot of SKUs, and we're going to touch on those ones. So you have to remember two really important concepts for monitoring and optimization. And those concepts are, so the first one is that you have the interactive operations, which are all operations essentially triggered by the users when consuming Power BI reports or sending DAX queries with paginated reports or applications like SQL Server Management Studio. And the other one is the background operations. Remember, background operations in this case, they are being used for anything related to moving data, transforming data, anything in the back end, anything that is happening behind the scenes by the data engineers, the architects, and so on. The takeaway of these two concepts is that in most scenarios, your background operations are going to consume most of your resources within the Microsoft Fabric capacity. So remember, so most of the resources will be used by the background operations. So in our medallion architecture implementations or data analytics platforms implementations within Microsoft Fabric, we find that most of the resources that are being used by background operations. Of course, there are some use cases like Power BI embedded and embedding reports within an application. If you are just embedding reports where interactive operations will make up for most of the resources used within the Microsoft Fabric capacity. So on top of this, when you get a Microsoft Fabric capacity, so you're essentially getting a specific number of resources for compute power. So remember, capacity units is the measure used to kind of try to standardize the compute power that you are given. So that means, so when you are getting an F2, an F4 tier, F8, F16, F32, so the number after the letter F, that means the number of capacity units you get per every second within the Microsoft Fabric capacitor. So you can see in this example, so how as well the numbers grow exponentially. And that's because every time that you double up resources, you get more capacity units. And how is this related to the pricing that you're going to pay? So this is related in a sense that you have to look at the pricing model. So when you look at the pricing as well, so you will see that with an F2, you get 2 capacity units every second, and in a pay-as-you-go model in US dollars, so you'll be paying $262 per month. And this grows exponentially as well. As you get a higher tier, you'll be paying more, you will be given more capacity units. One important point of this is that you can also scale up and down based on specific needs. So if at any specific point in time you are required to allocate more capacity units, you can easily do that within the same fabric capacity, and then scale back down as required. So going back to our previous example, where we have the different capacity units, you can see that if you were using Microsoft Power BI Premium, the previous license, they also give you a hint on how many Power BI vCores you are being allocated per each one of the Microsoft Fabric capacitors. You will see that the number is really, really low. It's super, super low. I mean, 0.25 of a vCore in an F2, that's not a lot. So while in reality, you might be able to achieve a lot with a lower end capacity, this is a really good indication for you to take into account that, if you are an enterprise organization who are looking to move terabytes of information every day or every week, so that will mean potentially that, hey, look, F2, F4, they might not be enough. So this is the first hint for you to take into account when choosing the different capacity that they are going to cover your needs in the organization. And the other thing that you have to take into account is the policy limits. And this is, from my point of view, it's a little bit hidden. So until you start using Microsoft Fabric capacity, and testing how it works, you will find that maybe that you start running into these challenges. So this is where background and interactive operations, they play a really important role. So you can see in here that if your usage is within 10 minutes of capacity units power, so you can borrow capacity units from the future. Let me put it this way, right? So you are given a specific number of capacity units in each tier. And you can see as well that in F2, you have, in a period of 10 minutes, you have 1,200 capacity units. So that means that you can borrow compute power from the future. So you can essentially borrow up to 1,200 capacity units within a period of 10 minutes without being penalized. But this becomes a little bit more challenging when you start borrowing more capacity units. In the second example, you can see that our usage is using more capacity units than the one within a period of 10 minutes, but less within a period of 60 minutes. So let's go back to our previous example. So let's say that we're moving some data, and moving that data is costing us 2,000 capacity units within a period of 1 minute. So that essentially means that, hey, we can borrow 1,200, but we still need to borrow another around 800. You take into account the moving window. So we have to borrow additional 600 capacity units. We can still borrow them, but our user will be penalized by being delayed 20 seconds in interactive. And as you go up the scenarios, you can get to a point where everything stops working. In the last example here, you can see that if you use more capacity units than the ones that you are located within a moving window of 24 hours, so that means if you are using more than 172,800 capacity units in F2 in a moving window, everything will stop working. And personally, with our implementations, we run into these challenges. And yes, well, you can scale up and scale down. That in many cases doesn't solve the problem immediately. But it could be, if you go from an F2 to an F16, definitely that will mitigate some of the challenges. But remember, capacity units is something that you have to keep your eyes on. You have to be able to monitor them and try to optimize. So I want to show you a couple of ways of monitoring Microsoft Fabric capacity units. And then we have a special guest today, Gilbert, who is a Microsoft MVP in data platform, who is going to help us navigate some of the limitations of out-of-the-box capabilities within Microsoft Fabric. Let me show you first that in the Power BI portal in the Microsoft Fabric capacity, as we've seen in one of our previous videos, you can navigate to the different out-of-the-box apps. And within the apps, you can install the Fabric Capacity Metrics app. So when you're installing the Microsoft Fabric Capacity Metrics app, so it's going to ask you for you to provide the capacity ID and so on. And once that you configure the Microsoft Fabric Capacity Metrics app, you will get access to monitor your Fabric capacity. As you can see, out of the box, you get a nice drop-down to monitor your capacity. And if you have multiple capacities, you will see those ones listed in this drop-down. And then you can start looking at some of the concepts that we visited before as well. So you can see that we have on the top left corner, we have the number of capacity units used by the different types of items within Fabric. And you can also see on the right side that you have the background and interactive operations. And this as well, a really big line that shows the capacity units limit in case if you are borrowing capacity units from the future, you will see a few spikes in here. It's great to get this Microsoft Fabric monitoring app out of the box. It is one of the first items that you should be provisioning when monitoring Microsoft Fabric capacities, but at the same time, it has some limitations. So you can see that we only have 2 pages. We have a page that covers storage, and it talks about the volume, how much data were being stored in one lake. I would say, look, storage is the most cost-effective item within Microsoft Fabric ongoing pricing. Storage shouldn't be a challenge for you in many cases in regards to pricing, but you really want to be able to extend this. And out of the box, this Microsoft Fabric monitoring app only contains 14 days of data. That's all. So you get 14 days of data. You can see that in this chart, we can get 14 days of data. In any data analytics environment, this is not enough. It's not enough. All the solutions that we have built in the past, you want to keep the historical information of the usage of the capacity metrics, or in the old school, you want to keep how many cores, how many memory, you want to keep track of that and be able to create alerts and so on. So with this app, you cannot do it. And that's why for today, I'd like to invite our special guest, Gilbert, who is a Microsoft MVP here based in Australia as well, who has built a solution that helps us overcome some of those limitations within Microsoft Fabric monitoring app. Hey, Gilbert, how you doing?
Hey, David, how are you? Great, thanks.
How you doing? So nice to see you again. I know that we have spent a lot of time this year with me asking questions, about the different types of background operations, interactive operations, how to overcome some of those limitations. But I understand you created a solution to overcome some of those limitations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned before, the challenge is monitoring your capacity over time so you can understand what's actually happening. And typically 14 days sometimes is just not enough time. We're all busy. You might not get to it till a month later, but then you've lost potentially some of that historical data.
Yeah. And before we continue, actually, I know you for years, but can you share with everybody what you do?
Yeah, well, I'm a data analytics consultant just working in the Microsoft space, both with Power BI and Fabric, pretty much just helping customers with their data needs, whatever that is, or every customer is different.
Yeah. And you have a really cool company name and logo as well, right?
Yeah. It's for me. It's a little cow over there. Hopefully, it's some people recognize it, which is great.
That's all right. Cool. Look, let's keep going. So I know you prepared some demonstration, and I've been using that app personally on my side. So why don't you show us what you've done actually to overcome some of the existing limitations to better monitor the Microsoft Fabric capacities?
Yeah, sure. So what I thought I'd start off with is just the output of what this looks like, and then take one step back and show you how we get to that. So as you mentioned previously, with regards to storing this information over time, this is just my personal tenant, and as you can see, it's not very busy. But what you can see, for example, is I've got data going back till December, and keeping that data going forward. And as you can see, for example, this is also because this data is being pulled out of the capacity metrics app and stored. Not only is it easier to navigate, it's also a lot quicker. For example, you can see I have this big spark over here. And if I actually had to just click on that, if I can click on it successfully, you can then see it's very responsive, it's very quick. And then I can see what it was actually happening on that day, that it was a notebook that was running. And this, just in this example, what happened was the pipeline was failing for a while. So that's why it was running for such a long time, because it was actually catching up all this historical data. So another question that typically gets asked is who's doing what on the capacity. And right now, when you're using the capacity, that's quite a challenge, because you've got to try and find like the little time point, for example, over here on the right. Then you got to right click, drill through, and you got to go backwards, forwards. And that can be quite cumbersome, take a lot of time to try and figure out what's going on. So once again, by bringing this data in, for example, if I see the spark over here, I could literally just highlight this information, and then what it'll do is, do I have a filter somewhere? I might have a filter. Let me get rid of that one. Let me just try that again. So if I highlight this, what you should then see is I'm then just highlighting that period of time, and then I can quickly see who's doing what. So it was me running, but it could be someone else in the organization. What type of operation was it? It was a notebook pipeline run. Where is it? What is a workspace? The duration? How much of the capacity did it consume? The total CUs, and get that over time. So once again, makes it really easy to identify and to go, oh, okay, look at this. I can see also on the right hand side the percentage of my capacity, so it aligns with what you're seeing in the metrics app. So you can see when things are going over 100% to understand what is actually consuming that. Because a lot of the time, I have found when you get the sparks over 100%, it's those interactive queries, people using reports. So are they doing big extracts, or does the model need to be optimized? That kind of stuff. The background processes typically just run along in the background, and sort of like these gray lines over here, they go a little bit up and down, but because they're smoothed over 24 hours, they they're not as spiky. They don't potentially impact your capacity directly. So the way that I actually do all of this is I use a notebook to get all that information. So just at a very high level, I won't go through the whole notebook because it's quite long and it's quite a lot of things going on. But typically, all that we're really doing is we are connecting to that same semantic model that's provided to us. First, I'll just always refresh it to make sure I've got the latest data. And then what you can see, just as an example, if I come down over here, is what I'm effectively doing is I'm actually just running a DAX query against the semantic model, pulling that information out, and then storing that information into staging tables like your typical data warehouse patterns, and then finally putting that into a fact table. And that is just looping through all the different tables because you've got to bring all this different information together and then structure it in a way so that it can then be brought into the semantic model. So it pretty much just goes through all of that. For some customers, it's running once a day. Other customers that I have, it's running every few hours because they need to know during the day what's happening to the capacity. When they get a capacity notification that it's spiking over 100%, they want to understand, what's causing the spike. Is it a prolonged spike? Is it going to affect the capacity slowdown? That kind of thing. So that's pretty much it in a quick overview.
That's great, Gilbert. So I wanted to ask, personally, before we move on, thank you for sharing that. I wanted to share a little bit of like a tips for companies, who want to optimize their fabric capacities. And I thought, look, now that you're online, I want to pick on your ideas, basically. Do you have any recommendations to organizations on how can they optimize resources essentially in Microsoft Fabric capacity?
Yeah, well, the main thing what I've found is that it's those interactive queries that can really cripple a capacity typically, because they happen in those 10-minute blocks. If it bursts more than 100% for more than 10 minutes, then it's going to start slowing down the capacity. So people immediately are going to start pinging who's ever responsible for the capacity, saying, hey, my reports are now slow. Half an hour ago they were fine and now they're slow. So what that comes back to is making sure that your semantic model is optimized as it can be using the star schema. Your DAX measures are written in a way that aligns with the star schema. So everything is highly optimized so that it's consuming only the capacity units it needs to consume. Because unfortunately, I have seen some situations where it isn't done that way. And then as soon as people open reports, the capacity usage goes through the roof, like way over 100%.
The typical report with 100 Power Query transformations and 100 relationships, and all the columns in the database, essentially. Yeah,
exactly. And to be fair, it's also sometimes you've also got to watch the background processes, because I once had a customer who they had like the citizen developer or the self-service developer creating a data flow and just going, I'm just going to refresh it. Like I'm going to click refresh 5 times. And the background usage went over 60%, which is not typically that normal, but 60% background usage means you've only got 40% for your interactive during the day, because that background process will now run for the next 24 hours at 60%. So, so sometimes you've got to manage, you've still got to look at the background processes and make sure that things are running optimally.
Yeah. That's why even like having multiple Fabric capacity, one for your critical workloads and another one's, more like a developer front facing or, data champion front facing could help mitigate some of those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And something that you mentioned as well, I think, and this applies to everything, okay, best practices. So all those best practices that people like Gilbert, and myself, we've been talking about for so many years, they will help you keep your ongoing costs low, because you will use less capacity units. I would say less is more in Microsoft Fabric. The less you do, while you still have to meet the business goals and so on, but the less you do, the less you're going to spend in Microsoft Fabric. That's the reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, look, we're going to wrap it up for today. We haven't go maybe into a lot of detail, but I think today is really good summary on how you can go and start monitoring some of those Microsoft Fabric capacity units, keep your costs down, how to overcome as well some of the limitations or with the solution that Gilbert created. If you have any questions about that solution, go and reach out in Gilbert and go to visit formu.com. Is that right, Gilbert?
Yep, that's the one. Yep.
All right, cool. Yeah, we'll see you next week. And thank you, Gilbert, for contributing today to the live stream.
Yeah, thanks, David. Great to be here.